I have so much to say and so little time to say it in that I am almost speechless. But let me thank the Labor Center, and also, I don't know if Emmanuel Says is still here, but your work has been so important to all of us, and thank you for that. I mean, you have revealed what most of us assumed, but because you looked at the actual tax data, you've given us a world of information, and you keep on updating it, and every time you update, it's a national event. And Paul, thank you for your work. The work that you and Jacob Hacker have done on inequality and the politics of inequality has been invaluable, and thank you. And I really, Berkeley has become sort of a center of all of this. I teach a course called Wealth and Poverty. I'm not going to try to teach the course in the next half hour. What I'd like to do, though, is talk a little bit about yesterday, because the general election began yesterday. There was no blowing of trumpets. There was no drum roll. But Mitt Romney has basically cinched the Republican nomination, and President Obama gave a speech yesterday which frames the way he and Democrats will approach this election. What's significant about the speech, and I draw your attention to it, and also to a speech that he gave on December 11th, I believe it was, in Kansas. This is the first time. Now, I have worked with and for and around a number of presidents, all of them Democratic except one. I was actually employed by the Ford administration. Nobody knows that. Keep it in this room, please. No, but what I have to say really applies to Democratic and Republican presidents. This is the first time in that December speech and in the speech yesterday that I remember a president saying that inequality was the central issue that this country is facing. And when he's talking about inequality, and when we are talking about inequality, and I'm sorry I missed the beginnings of the comments before, but we're not just talking about Gini coefficients and the top 20% versus the bottom 20%. The big inequality is the extraordinary concentration of income and wealth at the very top, which has enormous implications for our democracy, for our economy. Again, I'm not going to go through all of that. Maybe you've already gone through some of this, but I want to concentrate on what the president said and what is likely to happen. He used the term yesterday, which I have never heard him use. In fact, I don't think I've ever heard a president use before, social Darwinism. He accused the Republicans, that Paul Ryan budget, that slide right there, of really being social Darwinists. Now, I don't know what percentage of the public has any idea what the president was talking about. But it's interesting. William Graham Sumner, I predict his book, 1883, What Social Classes Owe to One Another, may be a bestseller again. And you ought to look at that book if you haven't had a chance. It is still in print. It is in paperback, maybe in hardback. But in that book, William Graham Sumner, who really provided a justification, a legitimation of the Gilded Age, of that extraordinary inequality, both in terms of economics, but also in terms of our democracy. He justified it on the basis of not Charles Darwin. Darwin never used survival of the fittest. It was Herbert Spencer, a British philosopher who basically took Darwin, made it into kind of this ersatz social science, and then he was brought to the United States by William Graham Sumner to the point where John D. Rockefeller, when he was accosted by the press at the turn of the last century, said, well, and then he quoted William Graham Sumner about the survival of the fittest and why it was perfectly appropriate for the best people, quote unquote, in America to be making millions and millions and millions of dollars, and why it was good for the nation. For the president to use this term, I think is very indicative of how extreme he feels, but I think justifiably, this budget is. And the fact that Mitt Romney has identified himself so directly with this budget, saying it's quote unquote marvelous, using the term marvelous, also sort of provides a framing mechanism. What do we do about all of this? I think the answer is not simple. I spend an entire term trying to talk about causes and public policies that could be relevant to reversing the trend toward inequality in this country and in other countries. I think that the probably three most important public policy areas are, number one, raising taxes on the wealthy, and we can talk about that to the extent that I preserve time in this half hour. The second would be, in my mind, expanding the earned income tax credit, which is a wage subsidy, a reverse income tax. This is not a liberal idea. This came out of basically a lot of very conservative writers and conservative minds. And then thirdly, investing in education, starting with early childhood education. There is a huge amount of data showing that early childhood, if you get to kids before they start school, ideally 0 to 5, stimulate them, engage them, enable those brains to actually feed on some real stimulation, you have remarkable consequences. And the social science data, there are very few things that the social science data are basically unambiguous about in terms of positive findings. And we have now 40 years of findings tracing children who have been in enriched early child education learning environments versus control groups, same kids, basically same kids from same communities, but just randomly did not get in them, and the results are amazing. The differences, 20 years, 30 years out, are staggering. And if I had my wits about me, I would have presented nothing but early childhood education and put some charts on the board. Now, finally, how do we get any of this done? I mean, let's say we had those three and then accompanied by a whole bunch of other policies we thought were very important. How to get it done if we have a politics that is dominated by the wealthy, who will not even allow, this extraordinary loophole called carried interest that provides people like the partners of Bain Capital and other private equity partnerships and many hedge fund managers the opportunity to declare their income as capital gains at a 15% rate, when in fact the entire justification for a lower capital gains rate, if you think there should be a lower rate, and I don't, but the whole justification is that investors risk their capital, their own capital, and therefore ought to have some incentive, but the private equity managers don't risk their own capital. They risk other people's capital. So there's not even on its face, in terms of its own logic, a reason for this. How do you get a change when Congress, including a majority of Democrats, will not even change that loophole, close that loophole? The only way is through a movement. And I say this quite sincerely and as passionately as I possibly can. Labor used to be a movement. Paul is absolutely right about this and the significance of organized labor. In the 1950s and 60s in this country, we congratulated ourselves, having survived the 30s and the 40s and not succumbed, as other nations did, to communism or fascism or some other ism. We congratulated ourselves for saving capitalism from its own excesses through what we called at that time pluralism. We said the big corporations are counterbalanced by small businesses. Big business is also counterbalanced by unions. We had big Wall Street counterbalanced by small community bankers. And the pluralist idea, in fact, John Kenneth Galbraith talked about countervailing power. The pluralist idea has basically vanished. There is no countervailing power any longer. I served in Washington starting in the 70s, and then again in the 80s, and then again in the 90s, and I've been down there too much this past decade. And I can tell you there has been an extraordinary change, a tide of big money coming into Washington, mostly big business and Wall Street, and then a kind of a basket of Koch brothers and other kind of extremists, mostly on the right, who are shelling in their own money. There is no way of dealing with this absent a political movement that hopefully incorporates organized labor, helps organized labor do what organized labor has always done, not just bargain for wages, as was said, but also be a political force. I had hoped the Occupy movement would be that movement. Maybe it will be. Movements don't happen overnight. My biggest concern, quite frankly, and I'm going to end on this upbeat note, my biggest concern is that people in America, particularly young people, but all sorts of people, they suffer from a kind of attention deficit movement disorder. That is, we expect things to happen so quickly that if in 6 months or in a year we don't see a complete revolution in the way our system is run and the way power is distributed, we say, well, we're not going to get anywhere. Cynicism is the most corrosive emotion we have with regard to turning any of this around. And if you are cynical at the age of 25, there's no hope for you. By the time you get to be my age, you might as well just dig a grave for yourself. No, these things take years. The civil rights movement took 30, 40 years. The women's rights movement is still going on. The disabilities movement, the getting women's suffrage, the anti-slave movement. I mean, these movements go on for sometimes an entire generation. So I'll say to you what I do not say in a classroom. I try to bury my own values and my own opinions in that classroom because I'm interested, for the purpose of the course, in getting people to think for themselves. But here, I'm not constrained. I'm just going to tell you what I think, and that is get on the train as it emerges from the station, because this is probably the most important set of issues we face in this country. Who gets what and why? And the consequences for our democracy, and the consequences for the economic health of the country as well. I'll stop preaching and answer any questions you have. Yes.
If we keep going with the same rate and we pass the Ryan budget, so on and so forth, say none of the solutions that we propose work, how will America's democracy be affected?
If the Congress and the next president signs into law Ryan's budget, how will American democracy be affected?
You said it will corrode.
Well, I think the corrosion of democracy is not the Ryan budget. The corrosion of democracy is the fact that you have now, particularly after Citizens United against the Federal Election Commission, but even before that, money is very powerful. I mean, the Supreme Court case Buckley against Vallejo said money is speech. And then you add to that corporations are people. And if money is speech and corporations are people, and combined all of that with a huge increase in concentrated wealth and income at the top, then you are almost, by just the logic of the and force of what you've created, in trouble democratically, because with that money comes huge political power, and we've already seen it. I mean, when I started in Washington in the 1970s, organized labor had a lot of lobbyists on the Hill, but so did a lot of groups. Business groups were sort of one set of groups with lobbyists. Now, it's almost all Wall Street and big business. Almost all. Yes.
So the first issue that you mentioned as a potential solution would be taxing the wealthy, and it appears over the last 30 years, anti-tax organizations like the Howard Jarvis Taxpayer Association have grown tremendously, and yet counterbalancing organizations that advocate solely for the purpose of raising revenues haven't emerged. Why do you think that is, and do you think that that's a sort of a missing piece in the movement that you?
So why haven't we created, or why haven't there emerged organizations that say basically tax the wealthy? Why are there just very powerful don't tax the wealthy organizations? Well, part of it is a collective action problem. That is, if you are wealthy, there are relatively few people who have all that wealth, and you not only can see directly your interest in reducing taxes, but you can mobilize with your wealth very easily around that set of themes. If you're an investment banker who happens to be a private equity manager, you're going to make sure that you keep that loophole in the law that lets you declare your income as a capital gain. The rest of us, tax policy, our eyes glaze over. Who is going to organize us around tax policy? With regard to the anti-tax crusades that thundered across America beginning in the late 1970s, Howard Jarvis and others, I am of the view that a lot of what took place was the middle class, whose wages were starting to flatten, and you had a lot of blue-collar men whose wages already, adjusted for inflation, were starting to drop. Nobody wanted to pay more taxes. And if you described, and most of those were not described as taxing the rich or reducing taxes on the rich. They were described as reducing our taxes on all of us. That was an easy sell for people that were feeling increasingly economically insecure and oppressed economically. So the way out of this quagmire is to do what the governor and Molly Munger, unfortunately they're both competing against each other, typical, are trying to do in California, which is let's tax the very wealthy and let's connect those taxes to something that we all want, such as good schools. Now, that's a way of framing it that's pretty powerful. Other questions? Yes, sir.
One thing that was really not discussed and touched on today is religion in all of this. This country of ours believes that religion is so overwhelming. Christianity is often worn on people's shirt sleeves. And we look at the Europeans as those people who are agnostic and don't believe and so on and don't have the same values we have. Yet at the same time, and I would appreciate your comment on this, is that we don't seem to care that budget up there about the poor amongst us. Those that we believe in religion, we should care about a great deal. And certainly the right is very religious. I would appreciate your commenting on that influence in all this, or the juxtaposition.
Well, I would say your question is to what extent is religion a very important aspect of all of this? And I think it could be. I mean, the churches of the 1960s, they led the charge with regard to civil rights and social justice. There's also the issue, though, of patriotism. I mean, even if you are secular, if you truly believe in patriotism, you believe in making sure that this country is strong and that everybody has an opportunity in this country. I mean, patriotism doesn't mean just military might. It translates into a nation where people feel that bond of social solidarity. One reason I believe we as a country had such high marginal taxes on the very wealthy, and we did so much in terms of public education and infrastructure in the post-war years, was because we had all had that collective experience of not only Depression, but Second World War. And we came out of that experience, and it was very easy for people to understand, there but for the grace of God go I. We are all together in something called a nation, and we're all very proud of what we accomplished. Well, that generational memory is, in a sense, lost. We still do have patriotism in its best positive sense. We still do have, potentially, an appeal to religion. I want to go back to, and I want every one of you, if you can, to read Obama's those two speeches, because what he tries to do in framing the issue is exactly what we're talking about, rekindle that sense of social solidarity. Yes, up there. Yeah.
So considering the corruption of the entire political system by corporate groups, as you're talking about the lobbying and Citizens United, how can the movement best relate to the Democrats, the less corrupted party, and electoral politics in general?
Well, I agree with Paul on this, that you've got to begin by establishing real credibility politically. And what the Tea Party did was essentially go to what were considered to be relatively safe Republican seats, and in primaries challenge those incumbents with people who were, frankly, more radical. And all you have to do is win, 2 or 3 of those races, and from that point on, every incumbent Republican starts looking over his or her shoulder and saying, well, wait a minute, is there a Tea Partier coming after me in the primaries? Orrin Hatch, if they get rid of Orrin Hatch is not a moderate. If they get rid of Orrin Hatch, and Orrin Hatch is running for his life. I mean, Dick Lugar, is a wonderful, wonderful man, and I am personally going to be terribly upset if he is booted out, and I'm afraid he probably will be. But Orrin Hatch, I'm not going to stay up nights wailing about the loss of Orrin Hatch, but that is a very important victory for the Tea Party, just like Bennett in Utah was an important victory for the getting rid of Bennett. This is politics. This is brass knuckles politics. The Tea Party is backed by some big money. Dick Armey, for example, and the Koch brothers and others are training people to run. They are running, training workshops and seminars. They are working this out in very, very sophisticated ways. This is not just a random hi, hello. We're a movement. Yeah.
And I think that's why the Tea Party may not be the best analog, because they are so allied with corporate interests. And I'm wondering how plausible it is to run more radical candidates with Citizens United.
I'm in my non-day job, I am chairman of something called Common Cause, which was founded, not incidentally, by a Republican 40 years ago, and its purpose is to try to get big money out of politics. After Citizens United, there was a huge influx of contributions into Common Cause. I mean, this is a defining moment. People are very upset in this country. People, look at the coverage of the super PACs. I mean, even Republicans I talk with. I was on the phone yesterday with a prominent Republican, I do speak with them, who was telling me that after the election, there is going to be a huge reaction in the Republican Party against the super PACs and against what's going on because they really don't like what's happening. There is, again, a window of opportunity, and there is public outrage. And just to put in a plug, the reason I have this little ebook selling at $2.99 called Beyond Outrage is because I really do think it's time to get beyond outrage and start organizing. Yes, in the back.
So I'm a union organizer, and I'm working on a big effort to organize the workers at Walmart. And we're really, I like what you said, some of the earlier speakers said about how it's not just about bargaining for wages and benefits, but it's really about being a force overall. And I'm just curious on your thoughts around framing on sort of what we're calling on Walmart to do, because it isn't just to pay people a little bit more in the stores, but it really is to, we want to
Well, I would do two things. I would, first of all, use a word that some liberals and progressives and people on the left are, for some reason, a little bit embarrassed to use, and that's the word fairness. The president in that Kansas speech used the word fairness 15 times. I mean, and fairness is connected to morality. We should not be afraid to talk about economic morality and economic immorality. Why should we allow Republicans and the right to have a stranglehold on the word morality? I mean, when they talk about morality, they talk about bedrooms, not boardrooms. But the real threat to this country is what is happening in the boardrooms in terms of treating workers like garbage and basically making Wall Street's demands for quarterly profits the only consideration. So I would talk about fairness. I'd talk about morality. And I'd also use Citizens United. If corporations are citizens, then don't citizens have some responsibility to the country? Yes.
On forum this morning, there was a talk about the National Association of Scholars, which has a new report out that's digging the University of California because it's so liberal, and that there's too much liberal politics in the classroom. And it seems to me, I kept wondering, why now? And it must be to bring up another front in the argument against left and progressive politics, because they're actually afraid of us and want to distract. But did you happen to hear? I think it's.
This comes up all the time, and this is just another chapter in a broad-based attack that actually started about 20 years ago on colleges, universities, and faculty. Look, my philosophy on this is very, very clear. Faculty have no business indoctrinating, telling students what their own personal opinions are. Our job is to get students to think hard and to really question their pre-existing notions. I mean, what I try to do in my classrooms, I play devil's advocate. But that does not mean that we are prohibited or should feel prohibited from talking about issues of, getting what I was saying a moment ago, public morality. This is not liberal or conservative. The question is, what is the kind of society we want? You know, before Alfred Marshall wrote his Principles of Economics in 1890, the subject of economics was embedded in politics. It was all called political economy. And more importantly, in the 18th century, it was not even called political economy. It was called moral philosophy. Adam Smith called himself a moral philosopher. He was prouder of his book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, than he was of the work of The Wealth of Nations. And we've got to, again, in the classroom, in a university, I think it's part of our responsibility to ask, what is the nature of a good society?
I totally agree with you, and I'm just worried about the noise that it's going to make.
Well, there's going to be a lot of noise. I mean, that's, don't worry about noise. I worry when there's no noise. Yes.
Globalization seems to be like a double-edged sword. Do you think there should be efforts to deglobalize, or do you think...
I'm sorry, should there be?
Efforts to deglobalize, or do you think policy can rectify conditions within wealthy nations and among developing nations?
Well, my own view is that isolationism, autarky, a kind of trying to separate ourselves from the rest of the global economy would hurt us and hurt everybody else. If we're concerned about global poverty, that's the last thing we want to do, and we should be concerned about global poverty. If we're concerned about the American economy, we don't want to aggravate the worst aspects of the economy, such as we saw occurring in the isolationist phase of the Great Depression. No, we can be part of the global economy without getting into a race to the bottom. That's the issue. For example, global labor standards. That's something that I spent a lot of time on when I was labor secretary. Well, if we think about global labor standards as divided into two categories, one are the basic core standards. We don't want child labor. That's right. That is, we don't want 10-year-olds or 7-year-olds working 7 days a week. We don't want slave labor. You know, there's certain things that we as a civilized community of nations will not tolerate. But when it comes to what's the minimum wage, what are the appropriate working conditions, obviously those are going to be on a sliding scale depending upon what a nation can afford. And if we say that everybody has to have exactly the same working conditions and labor conditions and wages as in the United States, that would be a backdoor to protectionism. That's not fair to developing nations. But if we said, for example, what about a minimum wage that was 50% of the median wage? Maybe we should negotiate that. Add that to our treaties, because you see, that could be a developing standard. As the median wage rose, the minimum wage could rise as well. We should have a minimum wage that's half of our median wage. That's how you spread some of the benefits of economic growth. I don't want to overstay my welcome. Somebody needs to tell me when I'm... Okay, one more question. Yes, in the back.
How does the Republican Party appeal to the middle-class voters if so much of their policy actually undermines the middle class?
How does the Republican Party appeal to middle-class voters when so much of what it does undermines the middle class? Well, I'll tell you how it does it. It really does prey upon the frustrations, anxieties, and the anger that people have who feel powerless. You know, if you feel frustrated and angry and powerless, and I tell you who to blame or whom to blame or what to blame, blame the poor, blame immigrants, blame foreigners, blame government, blame liberals, blame the San Francisco Berkeley axis, blame. But the blame game, that is right-wing populism, and this is not new. I mean, the left-wing populist would say, blame the rich, blame big corporations, blame Wall Street. Unfortunately, we understand that it's much more complicated than that. We're talking about systems. They're not evil people. I mean, there may be a few evil people, but most people are part of a system. They are playing the system as they understand the system is to be played. We need to educate people about really the systemic aspects of our political economy, what needs to change, why it can change, why people are in such a bad state. I mean, this for most people are not enjoying a recovery right now. The recovery is basically the top 10%. Most people are seeing their wages drop adjusted for inflation, and their major asset, which is their homes, continue to decline in value. Most people don't have very much by way of a 401k, or they're not participating in the bull market on Wall Street. So this is just to say, and I'm going to wind up by summary, nothing is going to change unless you and others like you stop complaining and make it change. No matter how good the people are we elect in Washington, nothing good happens in Washington unless good people outside Washington are organized and mobilized and energized sufficiently to make good people do the right thing in Washington. Do you understand what I'm saying? This is, again, it's not new, but it's more urgent than ever. Thank you.